Hello, ladies and gentlemen, I am Pronago, and we are going to be talking about Legends of Arcane, the first human book, a Warcraft 3 campaign by Shar Dundred. So, this campaign was billed as a macro-focused romp through an exciting new setting, and instead we got a bunch of pre-placed enemies, a couple mindless micro-slog missions that killed you if you walked up to a door that it said not to go to, a non-sequitur tug-of-war, which is used as its closing map, and basically no originality in the writing, that at least that I can remember. I would say none to speak of, though. I remember it pretty well. It's only been like a week since I've concluded the campaign, so, I do not disavow anything I'm about to say here. This is 100% accurate reportage, so feel free to smash that like button, So as you can probably tell, I didn't really enjoy myself in Legends of Arcane. There are really just a few points I'd like to hit at the beginning before we talk about gameplay, because gameplay is really the big thing that I want to talk about, like the pièce de résistance of the review. We're going to be talking about what I think about the gameplay, and specifically the macro, because again, the micro is just sort of like everybody knows that micro missions are bad and you shouldn't do them. Or if you do them, they have to be done in a very, very specific way that requires you to completely reinvent the game, basically, because you're removing so much of the game. And so since most people who watch my content are aware of this already, I'm not going to bore you to death by doing any more of that kind of discussion than what I've already done so far. We'll just hit on some brief points about the setting and the presentation and that sort of stuff before we hop into the gameplay. And so the setting of Arcane is supposed to be new, but honestly, it was pretty forgettable. I mean, it's been copy-pasting settings one-to-one since the first mission, as far as I can tell. I mean, you got the same humans and orcs. You got the same demonic invasion that throws the realm into chaos. Oh, void! The same, like, high elf tropes of them, like, looking down on the other races, thinking them inferior, calling them mortals or whatever. There's like a couple of differences that are fairly minuscule in the grand scheme of things, because they don't really do much to like shake the presence or the sense that there's not really much of a difference between this and Warcraft 3, like in the base game, which are like, the High Elves having an alliance with the humans in the past, and that being like predicated on some rocky shit, like them requesting aid but never giving it back or something. Like there is some, like, I guess, not really uniqueness, but there's something different there than what was in Warcraft 3 that wasn't really explored that much, from what I can remember anyways. And then the other one is like the undead actually trying to seemingly stop the demons or do something with the demons that isn't just serve them or help them, which I also thought was one of the only interesting moments or whatever. But even like item names or artifact names, like plot point names, are one-to-one. Like it's not Eye of Gul'dan, it's like Eye of the Fallen, or there's some skull or artifact or something that you get, and it's basically Gul'dan's eye or Gul'dan's skull or whatever. It's just really like oh no, it was the Eye of Sargeras I'm thinking of. So yeah, it was like a one-to-one copy of Eye of Sargeras, except the name was changed. It's just like really, really basic stuff that you really wouldn't expect to see in an original setting. You would expect to see this stuff. Like if you just changed some of these names or like made references to the original Warcraft 3, this would now be a Warcraft 3 campaign. That would be what I would expect. And yet here we have this insanity where I don't know, man. This is just really silly. Where it's just like lifting stuff one-to-one. The rest of the stuff seemed to come from Warhammer. I'm not familiar with Warhammer Fantasy. I don't know if it was adapted from Warhammer 40,000. I know that Khazarkin are from there and stuff, so like some of the naming conventions are similar. People in my chat were saying that the Empire is taken from Warhammer. I mean, I didn't really know that, but it didn't come across as particularly well developed anyways, and so even if that was in my mind like more unique to Warcraft 3 than the other stuff that was lifted one-to-one from Warcraft 3, that still doesn't really add many points, to Arcane, because the stuff that wasn't lifted one-to-one was really underdeveloped. And I mean, obviously Warcraft 3 itself is a pretty shitty story, so you're not going to get too much quality out of that particular production, especially if you're lifting stuff one-to-one and then not linking it together properly. As a writer, I look for stuff that reinforces a central theme, and the missions themselves didn't even really feel like part of a cohesive plot because it just kept jumping around with perspectives and introducing like 15 characters and stuff. So I'm not going to really go into the story itself because it wasn't really that interesting. I just wanted to talk about the fact that the setting itself seemed like it was just copy pasting shit one to one from other other settings, other games, and that was pretty disappointing for something that's supposed to be a new setting. I'm supposed to be experiencing something brand new that I haven't experienced before, and yet all I'm thinking of is how similar it is to a bunch of other derivative titles. And so I guess I'm just thinking about how derivative this setting is from other things. And that's not what I want to be thinking about when I'm experiencing your game, when I'm experiencing your epic story. So, the last thing I'll talk about before we hop into gameplay is that there were basically no new assets. I mean, obviously there's like, I think the clan elite for the orcs was different. The crossbowman is like a really horribly UV wrapped custom. I don't really know where that came from. But it like its unit icon and stuff was just like a flipped, just flipped footman icon. And then the portrait was like identical as far as I could tell. Maybe it was like a different pitch on the camera, maybe. I don't really remember. And so there's a lot of silly stuff like that that really just doesn't make any sense to me. Like, why would you go through that, why would you go through the trouble of adding new units and changing up the tech tree if you were not going to change it that much, which further reinforces the idea that this is Warcraft 3, not a new setting, and also just have like these really bad, generally speaking, lower quality than Blizzard's own work, which is saying something, models that don't, really, I mean, they're not even really fully custom, it's like a reskinned Felguard and, a slightly UV wrap modified footman or whatever. So it's just really silly on the technical side as well. I don't recall any custom sound effects. At the very least, certainly no custom sound sets. Maybe Edale has different sounds. I think she just has Jaina's sound set. But at any time you have a new setting and you're trying to say, hey, this is original setting, the lack of custom assets is immediately going to suck people out of it. If you're making a mod or a campaign or whatever, and you want to be, doing stuff that doesn't involve, the base game in any way, in terms of its like plot or whatever, then what you really don't need, it's like taking your Terran Marine unit and renaming it into like, I don't know, Dragon, whatever, who gives a fuck what it is, but like whatever you're renaming it to, that doesn't do the portrait differently, that doesn't change the graphic, that doesn't change the wireframe. So if you're doing something like this in Warcraft 3 as well, I mean, I feel for you, man. There's like, I guess that Valkyrie was a custom model, I think, as well. But I mean, the number is like on two hands you could count them, and for something that had this many units and this many characters and stuff, the fact that like I think actually most of the sound sets for the paladin like melee units, like Duke had the same sound set, I think. That Seabright guy had the same sound set. The healer Salamar, he had the same sound set. I don't know, man. It's just so crazy. I mean, this is meant to be a setting that isn't Warcraft 3 Warhammer /Fic, but there's really nothing about this experience that communicates the intent of having a new setting in any way. And from my perspective, if you didn't tell me this was a new setting, I wouldn't have known. I would have thought that this was like alternate reality or alternate history Warcraft 3 or something, where it's just different characters for whatever reason. I was like, that would have been my take. I wouldn't have known that this was a new setting. And maybe I would have had some inkling after like the first couple of missions or something. But you wanted that to be very obvious from the get-go without needing to read into external marketing. If you want me to believe your setting is unique, you have to take steps to introduce elements of your universe that are not just lifted, culturally appropriated from other settings. Especially the setting of the game that your campaign is for. Like, that's what really gets me, is that so much of the stuff is copied one-to-one from Warcraft 3, like the abilities listings for the heroes and stuff. Like, a lot of that stuff is just one-to-one. A couple of the stuff was custom, but it was really just like a different icon or whatever, and then maybe a different special effect instead of actually doing anything different, like from a technical gameplay standpoint. So it really just was pretty depressing at that point, I don't know, man. Unfortunately, all of these complaints are very secondary to the gameplay itself. I had a very appalling time with this project. at the bottom of the, at the end of the day, when you're talking about gameplay in a game, that's going to be the thing that is going to be the most important to me, because I'm going to be spending most of my time interacting with your game. Hopefully you're not making Deadly Premonition flame knives. Hopefully I'm spending most of my time interacting with the game as opposed to, reading text or whatever, which this project did have a lot of. The fact that people are still making projects without custom voice acting is so insane to me, but that's a whole different topic, I suppose. As far as gameplay is concerned, that is the most important part, and it completely fell apart in Arcane. And we're just going to be talking about macro. We're going to be focusing on macro because, again, I don't really care enough to talk about the micro stuff, or that tug of war shit at the end is very silly. But this gives me an opportunity to basically discuss why I feel the macro was such a failure in Legends of Arcane, hopefully giving Shar Dundred himself, if he bothers to check out the review, some ideas as to how to improve in the future, as well as other developers who are interested in maybe knowing why stuff like this is not really cutting it, knowing how maybe they can identify problems based on what I'm saying here, or if they agree with me or whatever, and then they can go in and try to find their own solutions to that. And so that is the main educational slant of this particular review. If you're just a player, maybe you want to know exactly why this stuff doesn't feel good to play, you can stick around as well and hopefully get educated. And obviously, as with all of my other content, you can contest me on any point in the comment section or directly on Discord. So with that out of the way, essentially, if you've seen or played Arcane, you know that the macro missions are very boring and unbalanced. Partially because of tech trees, partially because of the difficulty selection, just handing them stuff. So before I get into like the map specific issues or the AI issues, I wanted to tackle global changes to the way that the resources work in Arcane. So gold mines have basically infinite money. It's like insane amount of time would be required on the map to run out of money. And workers do not cost food. So the trade-off here is that, yes, you do get to have large-scale battles in Warcraft 3, which is something that most people don't really see, and that's probably one of the reasons why this campaign is held in any esteem at all, is because it's one of the few campaigns that actually has large-scale battles in it, and that people like large-scale battles, obviously. So I understand the motivation to make these changes because of what the result was gained, but some side effects that are really, really unfortunate make this feel incredibly short-sighted to me. This encourages players to spam workers and not care about supply at all. Like if you had only your starting town hall, you could just spam out workers with abandon and never really need to build farms or whatever until you actually needed to get troops. And so that changes build orders pretty significantly. I don't mind having large worker counts. I think if the issue is that people are getting into upkeep territory too fast, just remove upkeep or make the thresholds much wider and max out the supply cap a little bit higher, so it's like 150 instead of 100. Then you can have your large-scale battles, but players actually still need to interact with the game systems like food in order to make shit happen. I'm not really partial to upkeep. I understand why Blizzard put it in, is actually not completely just the issue of, hey, I want to have less macro or whatever, a lower scale. It's because their engine was so bad that they actually had to. So that's pretty depressing. But I understand why Blizzard put it in there. I don't really care for it myself. I like larger scale stuff. So I agree with the idea that there should be larger scale battles, but this was the wrong way to do it. The other issue, of course, being the gold mines having infinite resources, is that for one, you can just sit on one base and eventually outlast enemies because they use the same set of stuff, and you can after a while they don't rebuild their stuff if you are able to wipe out an entire enemy, as we saw in the Green Wave mission, the dwarf map. But generally speaking, I think the bigger issue here is that you're not punished for taking really long times to secure expansions, even if the AI is mining from them, because they will never mine it out. And so there's always gold left over for you to take. And you should be punished if you take a long time. Long time in Warcraft 3 standards is like 3 years, I know. But if you're taking that long to secure a base, as I did in many of these missions, I should have been punished. And I am a really, really horrible Warcraft 3 player. Like, I'm the worst player you've ever seen. And yet I was never punished for being that bad in those contexts. And these are direct results of the global resource changes that are present in every single mission. And so or every single macro mission, I should say. And so that I think is like a really important point to hit at the beginning, because this is going to color the understanding of the rest of the maps, and it contributes greatly to the issues of the rest of the missions. Another thing that was basically global is that every macro mission started you out with a whole bunch of pre-placed stuff of your own, gave you a whole bunch of starting tech, like 1,000 starting gold and stuff, and some pre-placed buildings, some pre-placed units as well, and basically just handed you a bunch of stuff and omitted the early game. And so that was pretty bad as well. And I'll get into a bit more why that's bad and what other things contributed to that in a few moments. So now we can talk about the AI specific issues. On the hard difficulty, there's basically, I played most of the missions, if not all of them, on the hard difficulty. I think I maybe have ran one micro mission on normal because I forgot to swap it back to hard. But aside from that, the macro missions consist of like an insane amount of resources just standing around, like resources worth of units, probably like over 20,000 20k gold just sitting around on the map waiting for you to interact with it, because they're all pre-placed. They just sit there. And these are military, these are buildings. They're just strewn across the map. And this means that you have to slog through them, grinding, slowly getting through them. Oftentimes through really, really high strength defense forces that the AI keeps in their bases and doesn't use for attacks, as far as I can tell, unless maybe they're like really low on units or something. And occasionally you'll defend against, fairly unthreatening waves for the most part. I think the exceptions were like 1 or 2 attack waves in the ship mission with Melon, and obviously the green wave mission, the dwarf mission that I referenced earlier. That is more so because your tech tree is so weak, you have to hug a fountain of health for dear life. Otherwise, you'll just roll over and die. So it was that was just disgusting for a couple of different reasons. It was like you already had all of these problematic systems that were removing and reducing interactivity in the game, and yet you were coming away from that thinking, well, it can't get much worse. And then you go into that mission, and you actually need to just sit at a fountain of health for most of your time there. Pretty bad. Oh yeah, that was also the mission where he would just spawn in a bunch of units and put you into high upkeep at the beginning of the game. What a set! That's the gift that keeps on hitting me, Daddy. So, I think the tech tree obviously is like that. That's like a very specific issue. There's like a lot of things that went wrong in that one mission that exposed how bad the overall construction and the underlying systems of Arcane were. So maybe it is good, to recall that mission and say like, oh yeah, that was the one that Pronago died on like 5,000 times and couldn't win until the end and all this other stuff. And you're right, it is. I told you I'm bad. It's also worth noting, and then vomiting, that the hard difficulty just hands the AI a bunch of upgrades. It hands them 3/3 upgrades. It hands them fortified armor, or fortified defenses, sorry. It hands them ensnare. It hands them all this stuff. Maybe it doesn't hand them certain abilities or whatever, but for the most part, they don't need to do any upgrading or researching. They just have all of this stuff handed to them on the first frame of the game. And that is just... that's pretty bad. I mean, you combine the fact that they have all of these upgrades, and they have all of these pre-placed units, and they have infinite money, because this is another thing. You add in the fact that they have infinite money. This is a recipe for the second coming of Hiroshima. I'm not fucking around here, man. This is like the most grind-based system I've ever seen in Warcraft 3 macro, and I know that there's not really many other examples of Warcraft 3 macro, which is probably one of the reasons why this ended up as poorly as it did. But you're really looking at something it's pretty fucked. You're looking at a gameplay experience that involves grinding against all of these pre-placed units that could just wipe you out on the first frame of the game. They could just A-move into your base, and you would then AFK, like if it was a player controlling all those units. And on top of it, there's all these other abstractions on the base game, right? The AI is playing a completely different game than you are. They're not playing Warcraft 3. They're not playing Legends of Arcane. They're playing some weird custom shit. They're not trying to attack you. They're not trying to defeat you. They're not trying to win. They're trying to do all this other weird shit. And that is, they're interacting with completely different systems. So of course they have to have their strengths gutted. But the problem is that just from a storytelling perspective, imagine just watching this without any dialogue, watching these troop movements, watching all of these AI units just sitting there doing nothing. That their military commanders must be a bunch of fucking retards. They must be a bunch of mongoloids. That's the only reasonable conclusion you can make. Or maybe the map designer is lazy. But, in the context of a storytelling perspective, to be, logically consistent, you have to imagine that whoever's making the call to not use all of these units to throw at the enemy base that has like 3 pre-placed knights or whatever, like what are you doing? Why aren't you doing that? Like, again, if the player was, had that advantage, they would also be doing that, unless they were role-playing or something, right? Like, they would actually be throwing shit at them. This isn't Dungeons & Dragons. They're not the Dragon Master, or Dungeon Master, sorry. Oh, that's embarrassing. But, yeah, that's like a really big problem, is that the AI is not interacting with you the same way that you're interacting with them, and it's creating this really toxic relationship between the two of you, where you're going to be interacting with them and running into a wall of pre-placed stuff, just all of this gold that's just sitting there, just being annoying and stopping you from interacting with the rest of the map. And then you have the AI just occasionally receiving orders to attack. They don't really personify a goal in any respect. They don't stretch across the map and try to block you off with buildings. They don't try to take important areas, be they choke points or neutral creep camps or the Fountain of Health or whatever, like item shops. They don't really try to do anything. They don't interact with the map or you in any way that a normal player would even attempt to, or that an AI, like a simulacrum of a normal player, could do or would do, right? They don't actually appear to have a will of their own. They just sit there and they exist to, like, occupy your time and waste your time. Like, Arcane is very non-competitive in that way, where it does not compete for your time at all. It does not value your time at all, very obviously. And that is like one of the biggest issues here, that hopefully people can come away with this review and come away with the playthrough of Arcane and playing it themselves, and any experience they've had it with themselves, they can understand why I reacted so negatively to it. Because that is like a really big issue, is that it's not competitive with, it doesn't try to compete for my time, right? So I think we'll move on now. Your opponents have no need for money, so denying them expansions is just a no-go. It doesn't do anything to them. Obviously, it lets you have the money. That's if they start out with any. I can't really remember any missions where they got expansions themselves. They begin with max upgrades, which disincentivizes you to interact with them in any way in the early game. You have to wait until you can equalize in some way, either getting tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, whatever upgrades you have at your disposal. Get whatever you can so that you're at the least amount of a disadvantage possible, and then you can fight them. But before then, don't bother interacting unless it's to defend yourself. There's an insane amount of pre-placed junk all over the map, and that prevents you from scouting, from getting map knowledge, from making early plays, harassment, whatever. Even if you wanted to suffer the max upgrade raiders that kill all your captains, you would still, have to deal with the fact that there's all this pre-placed stuff, right? There's all of these pathways that your decision making is funneled down. You're not really allowed to do anything free form. This results in the removal of the early game, I think, is like the main issue. And the same thing happens in a lot of StarCraft projects, but I don't think to this degree. It's not helped, again, by, like I said, you starting out with all this money and gold. All this money and tech and stuff, all this pre-play stuff. In general, I think pre-placing structures for the player should be done at great risk. You have to do a lot of extensive testing to make sure that that's even a valid placement for most people's strategies as well. Like, this is something that most people probably just don't think about, or maybe just completely disagree. Again, if you feel this way, feel free to reach out in the comments. But as a map developer, when you're placing a building for the player, that is removing the choice of the player to place that building somewhere else, or in that spot exactly themselves. And if that placement isn't optimal for a strategy they want to run, then they have one less reason to try it. They are disincentivized from trying a strategy that placing that structure in a different place would allow them, right? And this is why in Melee, in Melee, that's a good example of like when placement, base layout or whatever actually matters in some way, right? The base layout hugely impacts the outcome of early game fights, depending on like if you've walled off the right things. It impacts the efficiency of units coming out of your production structures and interacting with your army elsewhere on the map. They could get stuck somewhere. They could have to take a longer path, and we all know how Warcraft 3 pathfinding works. It could, make it so that it's less efficient to run back to your shop or something if you put it in the wrong place. There's all of these things that test the player's tactical knowledge, and less so their mechanical ability, but more so than a positioning before a fight would, right? Or at the very least, it's on par with positioning before a fight. Setting up your base in a proper way. It requires some preparation. It requires some understanding of mechanics, and that's all removed from this. It's no coincidence that I learned, quote unquote, that we were meant to stay in our base and play passively the entire time. We wouldn't be able. Rather, we wouldn't be punished for not taking early game advantages. Instead, we would be punished if we tried to do anything in the early game that involved interacting with the AI. If it didn't involve teching and upgrading and other things that only require 40 APM to do, then we were gonna... It would just be a disaster, right? It would be really, really annoying to deal with. And I just don't understand the mindset behind that, right? This is effectively making it a micro mission anyways. I mean, not really a micro mission. It's the same process, the same problem with micro missions themselves, where they're removing gameplay, because you are removing interactions and mechanics like scouting, early game harassment, creeping, item management, whatever. You're offering nothing in return. You're not supplanting new systems or new interactions for the ones that you're removing by starting the player out at tier 2 or tier 3 and with all of this pre-placed junk in the way. And I think that's the crux of Arcane's issues at the end of the day. Strategies that are normally possible in the game are prohibited, and there's not really a rhyme or reason to it. It seems that either it was an accidental byproduct of all of the changes, or it was a deliberate design decision because Shardundra didn't like that stuff. But at the end of the day, it feels pretty bad as a player who wants to be able to have as many opportunities to express my skill or lack thereof, that I get this, where I'm not really allowed to do anything, right? The strategic complexity not ever being rebalanced either is another thing. It would be different if I could adapt to the new systems and new strategies and new technologies that, mechanics or whatever, new tools that I have at my disposal. It would be different if I could do that. It would be different if Arcane offered a bunch of new ways to interact with the AI and interact with the game world. And then I would learn those in the early missions and be expected to master them very soon or, at some point later on down the line. But that's not the case here either. Like I said, there's never any attempt at rebalancing it. So... yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's just a glacial grind most of the time, right? It's really slow. It's not fun, for me anyways, and it doesn't require any mechanical skill. It doesn't really require that much strategery. It just requires an absurd amount of patience. And again, that indicates to me that the game is not really being competitive for my time. I don't really have much else to say. The rest of the design tenets or whatever, rest of the discussion would be discussing the micro missions or... the hero designs. Like I said, they're just copy-pasted from Warcraft 3. Or the base elements of the game that maybe should have been changed to improve interaction, which would be like battles being really unreadable, really difficult to read what's going on, time to kill being too high, unit collision being too high as well, too large, being really stupid as a result. But that topic of the base game, how many modifications should you make to the base game of Warcraft 3 in order to make it a more down-to-earth, reasonable RTS that rewards more of the decision-making and is more skill testing in the right ways, in my opinion. That's probably better served for an editorial, a by design video or something separate, because it's rarely seen as the responsibility of a campaign to make the base game better. I think that it should. I think it should be seen as that. If the base game could be improved, then yeah, a mod should come out and improve it. Especially in the climate that we live in now, where developers aren't really going to improve much. If anything, they're going to continue to screw stuff up. So I'm not really sure where to take that one, but I think Arcane would have benefited from these changes. I think even if they ended up backfiring in some way, even if removing the upkeep was a horrible decision or something, right? At the very least, I would have remembered, oh yeah, that's the campaign that doesn't have any upkeep. At least that would have stuck out. Even if it made the campaign suck even worse, I would have... remembered something about it besides the grind. I would have remembered the results of that decision, and I would have remembered the decision itself. And that's more than you can say than most of the micro missions, for example, and even a lot of the stuff in the macro stuff was really forgettable. But I will close with the acknowledgement that Shardundra attempted macro, and that's something that very few people in Warcraft 3 in the community seem to even care about, let alone attempt. So this is something I do appreciate, and I just hope that if he ends up making something else, or another developer is interested in taking a crack at it, then they can come away from this review and apply the sort of tenets or philosophies or whatever, whatever. They can apply something from it. They can abstract something from it and apply it to their current project or future projects or something like that. As of the time of recording, the second human book has shipped. I think it came out earlier this year of 2018. So... I will end up playing the first Orc book eventually, maybe sometime later on December, we'll see. But if you do play the second Orc book, it comes out sometime in 2019. And it's better in every way, and it has all of the solutions to the problems that I've posed here, then just send me a kiss, Bye.